For years, I was the quiet one. The sister who fixed everything, paid for everything, and asked for nothing. Their invisible foundation. Then, 3 days before Christmas, one call: don't come. Your energy. It's just too much for us this year. They expected me to break. To beg. They had no idea that my silence was about to cost them everything they took for granted. What happens when the person everyone leans on finally decides to stand up straight? 3 days before Christmas in 2022, Denver's streets sparkled under a fresh blanket of snow, and the faint, almost melancholic sound of soft jazz renditions of holiday classics drifted from passing cars. My world, however, wasn't sparkling. It was quietly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to unravel with the harsh ring of a single phone call. I just stepped into my small, one-bedroom apartment near Capitol Hill, the kind of place that's cozy for one but echoes with solitude if you let it. Exhaustion clung to me like a second skin after another grueling double shift at the community clinic. My fingers were still numb, a lingering ghost of the icy wind outside, and my breath fogged in the slightly warmer air of my entryway as I kicked off my boots. I peeled off my navy scrubs, the fabric stiff with the day's weariness, and sighed at the sight of the small suitcase by the door. It was already packed, a testament to my perpetual preparedness, my ingrained habit of thinking ahead for everyone. A pine green scarf, knitted with care, was folded neatly on top, and beside it, a handful of carefully wrapped gifts waited patiently, each one chosen with thought, with intention, like silent offerings to gods who rarely notice the sacrifice. I'd remembered the specific nutmeg my mother preferred for her eggnog. I'd even managed to track down the exact brand of toffee my aunt swore was the only kind worth eating. I had, once again, done everything right, meticulously so, clinging to the fragile hope that this year, finally, I'd be enough. This quiet diligence, this almost invisible hum of constant effort, was the soundtrack of my life. I moved through my days with the competence that often made me fade into the background, a reliable fixture, like an old, sturdy piece of furniture. My apartment, my routines, my very presence all designed to be unobtrusive, dependable. The serenity of these quiet Denver evenings, with snow falling softly outside my window, often concealed a depth of feeling, a reservoir of strength that few, if any, ever glimpsed. Does this quiet dedication, this unseen force holding things together, remind you of an extraordinary woman in your own life, someone whose true strength often goes unacknowledged? I'd love to hear about her in the comments below. Perhaps it's time their stories were brought into the light. My phone buzzed then, a sharp intrusion into the weary peace. Julian's name lit up the screen. My older brother. I answered with an automatic smile, the kind you've practiced so many times it feels like a reflex. "Hey Jules," I said, my voice still a little hoarse. But his tone wasn't its usual breezy warmth, it was careful, measured, like he was navigating a minefield. "Hey Lena, so, just a heads up. Marina's coming to Christmas this year." I paused, the name hanging in the air. His new girlfriend. The one who practiced sound healing and had once insisted on saging my entire living room because I'd casually mentioned I worked in palliative care, as if the sorrow of others was a contagion I carried. "She's really big on emotional alignment," Julian continued, his voice losing some of its forced neutrality, "and the energy you carry from the clinic. Well, it's just kind of a lot for her. So, we thought, maybe for this year, you could just take a break. You understand, right? Nothing personal." I stared at the blinking, multicolored lights on my thrift store Christmas tree. They suddenly seemed dimmer, their cheerful glow mocking me. Nothing personal. Before I could even process the sting of his words, before I could form a coherent response, my mother called. Her timing was impeccable, almost as if they'd rehearsed it. Her voice, when she spoke, was that familiar blend of sugar-coated steel, a tone I knew meant there was no room for negotiation. "Sweetheart," she began, the endearment feeling like a tiny, sharp shard of glass, "we just want peace this year. You know how sensitive Marina is. If you come, it could make things awkward." Then, the final, brutal blow, delivered without a flicker of hesitation. "Honestly, if you show up, we may not open the door." There were no lies this time, no sugar-coated omissions, just raw, unadulterated rejection, delivered with the casual efficiency of someone swatting a fly. I didn't shout. I didn't cry, though a cold knot was tightening in my chest. I didn't beg to be included, to be wanted. I just stood there, phone still pressed to my ear, the silence on their end deafening. I looked at the little pile of gifts I'd wrapped with such trembling hope, gifts for people who had never truly made space for me in their lives, people who only seemed to notice my absence when it directly inconvenienced their comfort or their carefully curated image of family harmony. And this year, finally, something inside me stilled. I let that silence, their silence, speak volumes for me. I moved slowly, deliberately, like someone folding up the last chairs after an invisible funeral, the funeral of a hope I hadn't even realized I was still clinging to. I opened my laptop, the soft whir of the fan a counterpoint to the frantic thumping of my own heart, and logged into my bank account. The automatic monthly transfer to cover my parents' overdue property tax, a quiet burden I'd shouldered for years, I canceled it. The small, consistent monthly deposit into Julian's perpetually struggling startup fund locked. The car insurance plan I had co-signed for Dad last year, the one that kept him on the road after his own policy lapse, terminated. I wasn't angry, not in the way that makes you scream or throw things. It was a different feeling, a cold, clear certainty settling in my bones. It was the chilling realization of being done. For so long, I had believed, with a child's unwavering faith, that if I just gave enough, if I stayed useful enough, if I kept showing up with casseroles and calmness and a perpetually understanding smile, I would eventually earn a seat at their table. Not just a physical seat at Christmas dinner, but an emotional one, a spiritual one. I thought that being dependable, being the one they could always count on, somehow made me indispensable to them. But in that warm, cinnamon-scented silence of my small apartment, surrounded by the low, comforting hum of my old radiator, the truth settled over me like the freshly fallen snow outside, soft, undeniable, and utterly covering everything. I was never celebrated. I was simply allowed, permitted to exist in their orbit, until suddenly, I wasn't. Outside my window, the first snowflakes of the evening began to fall, soft and certain, muffling the already subdued sounds of the city in a white hush. I stared through the glass, watching them drift and swirl, and felt something surprising, something I hadn't anticipated: relief. A profound, almost breathtaking sense of relief. No more exhausting effort to fit into a space that was never truly designed for me. No more asking, implicitly or explicitly, to be let in. No more shrinking myself, tiptoeing around their sensitivities, their preferences, their ever-shifting demands. This Christmas, I wouldn't be the outsider pressing her face to the cold window, wistfully watching a celebration she wasn't part of. I wouldn't be the almost enough they only remembered when something needed fixing, when a bill needed paying, when a crisis needed averting. I used to think this was normal, this invisible hierarchy within families, how some kids seemed to bask effortlessly in the spotlight, showered with softness and approval, while others were just expected to function like well-oiled machinery, or sturdy, silent furniture, steady, supportive, and, above all, quiet. My dad liked to joke at cookouts that I was the oldest, the practice run, the test child. It was said with a chuckle, but the words always landed with a thud in my chest. I was the one who had to earn affection through relentless usefulness, through academic achievements that were met with muted acknowledgement, through a quiet competence that they simply came to expect, like the rising of the sun. Meanwhile, Julian, 5 years younger, was the miracle baby, the charmer, the dreamer, the one whose flaws were reframed as endearing quirks or artistic temperament. When he skipped rent for the third time to fund his band's latest ill-fated album attempt, it was chalked up to ambition, to his passionate pursuit of his art. When I took an extra shift at the hospital to cover a shortfall or help a colleague, I was overdoing it again, too intense, too focused on work, not living enough. The double standards were a constant, unspoken hum beneath the surface of our family life. I remembered vividly when Julian, at 15, spray-painted a series of abstract, frankly chaotic, shapes across the pristine white garage wall. My parents had called it passion, art in its rawest form. They actually laughed, marveling at his unbridled creativity. 2 days later, I accidentally dropped a casserole dish, one I had made for a family gathering, of course, and I received a lengthy, stern lecture on carelessness and the importance of responsibility. It was always like that. Once, in high school, I meticulously filled out a FAFSA application, hoping for some financial assistance for college. I even highlighted the sections where my mother needed to sign. I left it on the kitchen counter, a silent plea. She never asked about it, never mentioned it. When my med school acceptance letter arrived, a moment I had dreamed of and worked tirelessly for, I brought it home like a hard-won trophy, my heart pounding with a mixture of pride and trepidation. She glanced at it, her expression unreadable, and merely muttered, "That's intense. Just don't lose yourself in it." Then she turned back to chopping celery, the rhythmic thud of the knife on the cutting board a stark dismissal of my triumph. Conversely, when Julian dropped out of college for the third time, this time to launch a healing podcast, despite having no discernible qualifications in healing anything, they hosted a welcome back and new beginnings dinner for him. There were candles, expensive wine, even balloons. I remember seeing a framed photo of Julian from his garage painting phase, clutching a paintbrush with the look of fierce concentration, still hanging prominently in the front hallway, treated like some sacred relic of burgeoning genius. This was the same house that had never thrown me a single graduation party, not for high school, not for college, not even for medical school. It seemed to vibrate with an almost palpable pride for the son who hadn't held a steady job in years, while my own quiet, consistent achievements were met with an indifference that slowly, steadily eroded my sense of self-worth within those walls. I once found one of my old sketchbooks there, half filled with doodles and quick sketches I'd made during rare breaks at the hospital, scenes of Denver sunsets glimpsed from a patient's window, the gnarled, expressive hands of elderly patients mid-recovery. It had been tossed carelessly into the recycling bin, buried beneath takeout menus and expired coupons. When I asked about it, a knot of hurt tightening in my throat, they just shrugged, laughed it off, said they thought it was scrap paper. And maybe it was, to them. Maybe I was too. Still, despite the constant, subtle dismissals, the glaring disparities in how Julian and I were treated, I kept showing up. Through the grueling years of med school, through the sleep-deprived haze of residency, through countless graveyard shifts spent in quiet, sterile rooms where most doctors didn't linger. Rooms filled with the ghosts of lives lived, with fading photographs on bedside tables, whispered regrets, and the palpable ache of being left behind, forgotten. Perhaps that's why I ultimately chose geriatrics. I saw myself, or a version of myself I feared becoming, in those long-forgotten spaces, in the eyes of people who had poured out their lives for others and were now primarily noticed only when things broke, when a medical crisis demanded attention. At home, my role never shifted, never evolved. I was the calm one, the capable one, the fixer, the invisible hand that kept the widening cracks in our family facade from spreading into irreparable fissures. I was the one who made sure the emotional, and often literal, bills were paid. When the old roof on my parents' house started leaking badly after a particularly heavy snowstorm, and their insurance, predictably, denied the claim due to some obscure clause about pre-existing wear, I paid for the repairs, quietly. No fanfare, no expectation of reimbursement, just another check written from my account, another problem solved before it could escalate into a full-blown crisis for them. When Julian's freelance graphic design work dried up, yet again, and he was facing eviction, I transferred the money to cover his rent and utilities without him even having to ask directly, the request usually coming through a worried call from my mother, hinting at his distress. When my mom's hip started locking up again, causing her considerable pain, and her physical therapist stopped coming because of a string of missed copayments they couldn't afford, I was the one who called, who rescheduled, who covered the outstanding balance, who coordinated her future appointments, gently nagging her until she actually went. Why did I do it? I asked myself that question 1,000 times, usually in the dead of night, staring at my ceiling. Was it because I loved them, truly, deeply, despite everything? Or was it because, somewhere deep down, I still believed that love was something transactional, something you had to earn through relentless sacrifice, through constant, unwavering utility? They never said thank you. Not explicitly. They didn't seem to feel the need to. In their world, in the carefully constructed ecosystem of our family, love, or at least my contribution to it, wasn't something that needed to be spoken aloud or acknowledged with gratitude. It was assumed, expected, as fundamental and unquestionable as gravity or daylight. And every time I handed over another piece of myself, my time, my money, my emotional energy, they took it. Not maliciously, I don't think, or at least I tried to convince myself of that. They took it blindly, unthinkingly, like a child takes a offered sweet, never once asking what it cost me, never once considering the toll it was taking. For years, I genuinely thought that's what family meant, what being a daughter and a sister entailed, being unseen but utterly indispensable. I was the scaffolding, essential for holding up the beautiful, sometimes precarious, structure of their lives, but never, ever the focus of the admiration or care. Always functional, always in the background, always removed when the primary structure was deemed stable enough, or when my presence became inconvenient. But that night, 3 days before Christmas, after those 2 brief, brutal phone calls telling me I wasn't welcome, that my very essence was too much, something in me, something I hadn't even known was under such strain, finally snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet internal shift, like a fault line giving way deep beneath the earth. I realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that scaffolding isn't meant to bleed for the building it holds up. It isn't meant to sacrifice its own integrity to the point of collapse. I was done. Done watching my life shrink, my own needs perpetually deferred, my own dreams put on hold, just to make their lives more comfortable, more convenient, more aligned with their desires. If this story, this slow unraveling of a family dynamic built on unspoken expectations and unacknowledged sacrifices, resonates with you even just a little, please don't forget to subscribe. There's so much more to come, and trust me, the next part. That's when everything truly begins to change, when the quiet ripples of my decision start to become waves. I remembered one particular Thanksgiving, just a year prior. Julian had impulsively bought a new set of expensive vintage lenses for some ill-defined documentary project he was supposedly working on, and then, predictably, couldn't afford his flight home. Without a second thought, I'd bought his ticket, again. He'd hugged me tightly at the gate when I picked him up, calling me the best sister in the universe, his voice full of that easy, charming sincerity he could turn on and off like a tap. And, just as predictably, by the following week, the gesture was forgotten, relegated to the past, just another favor folded neatly away into the invisible ledger of debts I was never supposed to acknowledge, let alone call in. No one ever had to directly ask. I was always one step ahead, anticipating their needs, their shortfalls, their impending crises. I was like some silent, tireless ghost in the background machinery of their lives, fixing, covering, smoothing things over, quietly, efficiently. Never truly seen, but always, it seemed, absolutely necessary for their continued comfort and functioning. They never said thank you, and perhaps, I began to realize, it was because gratitude makes it harder to keep leaning on someone so heavily, so relentlessly, without pause or compunction. Gratitude implies a debt, an acknowledgement of value received. It makes the giver visible. And visible things, I had learned, could be judged, could be found wanting, could be more easily dismissed or left behind if they became inconvenient. So, I had, in a way, colluded in my own erasure. I disappeared behind the drywall of their comfort, becoming the hidden structural beam that never buckled, that never complained, that simply bore the weight. Until now. Until that precise moment when their casual cruelty had finally chipped away the last of my carefully constructed denial. Sometimes, late at night, after a particularly grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital, I'd sit by my window, a cup of peppermint tea growing cold in my hands, and I'd let myself wonder. What would it feel like to simply be seen? Not for what I could solve, or pay for, or hold together with sheer willpower. Just seen. Not as a backup plan, not as a financial safety net, not as emotional scaffolding, but as Lena. Just Lena. A person with her own needs, her own dreams, her own fatigue. But those thoughts always felt like dangerous luxuries, like foolish, childish wishes. Wishes, I had long ago internalized, were for golden boys like Julian, with their sketchbooks and their grand, impractical dreams. Boys who were celebrated for their potential rather than their actual contributions. Wishes were not for girls like me, girls armed with tax software, spreadsheets, and a keen awareness of looming heating bills. So, I kept going. I brought the rich custardy bread pudding every Christmas, the one they all claimed to love, and I'd just smile and nod vaguely when they'd ask, "Oh, this is delicious. Who made this again?" As if it had magically floated in on a holiday breeze, rather than being the result of my careful planning and hours in the kitchen. When Julian's rent inevitably fell short, month after month, I'd wire the money without a word, without a lecture, just a quiet click of a button. When my parents called, utterly bewildered by their W-2s or some new tax form, I'd stay on the phone with them well past midnight, patiently guiding them line by line through the bureaucratic maze, while my own neatly stacked tax documents waited, unopened, beside my perpetually humming fridge. I told myself this was love. Love meant showing up, being steady, solving everything, absorbing the shocks. I believed, or desperately wanted to believe, that one day, if I just carried enough weight, if I just proved my worth enough times, someone would finally turn around, peer beneath the load, and truly see me under it all. But standing there in my tiny kitchen, the phone still radiating a faint warmth from the call that had effectively banished me from Christmas for the crime of being too much, I knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that I knew better now. They wouldn't see me. Not because they didn't care at all, perhaps, but because I had never, ever truly asked them to. I had meticulously, painstakingly, trained them not to. That night, with the scent of cinnamon still clinging faintly to the air from a forgotten potpourri and the snow falling like a soft, silent absolution beyond my window, I picked up my phone again. But this time, it wasn't to call them, not to beg for inclusion, or to plead my case, or even to express the cold fury that was slowly, steadily beginning to coalesce beneath the shock. I opened my banking app. Quietly, methodically, I hit cancel on the $800 automatic monthly transfer I'd been sending to my parents for years, the one that discreetly kept their mortgage afloat after a series of bad investments on my father's part. That steady drip of support, gone. The emergency savings account I maintained for them, the one they dip into for unexpected car repairs or sudden medical bills, I locked it, changing the access codes. No more surprise repairs on my dime. No more middle-of-the-night financial rescues. Julian's perpetually dead car battery next winter? That would be his problem to solve, or his inconvenience to endure. His art supplies, his studio rent, his dreams they would have to find another benefactor. At first, the actions felt almost robotic, strangely devoid of intense emotion. Just a few taps on a screen, cancel auto transfer, end payment authorization, freeze joint access. It felt as mundane as brushing my teeth or paying my own rent, a series of routine, necessary steps. But with every click, a strange, unfamiliar stillness unfurled inside me. It wasn't numbness, and it wasn't the bitterness I might have expected. It felt like freedom. A fragile, tentative bird stretching its wings inside my chest, suddenly realizing the cage door had been left ajar this whole time, and I simply hadn't noticed, or perhaps hadn't dared to test it. I found an old notebook, one I usually use for clinic notes or grocery lists, and I made a list. Not to guilt myself, not to tally up grievances for some future confrontation, but just to see it, to bear witness to it myself. All the quiet, unacknowledged debts I had swallowed without a word over the years. The emergency flights for forgotten family events I was still expected to attend, the unexpected surgeries for pets I barely knew, the bounce checks I'd covered to save them embarrassment, the broken-down cars I'd paid to have towed and repaired, the dozens, no, hundreds of small and large emergencies I had patched up behind the scenes, without thanks, without ceremony, without even a simple acknowledgement. The ink on the page blurred, not from tears of sorrow, but from the sheer, overwhelming weight of finally, truly, witnessing my own exhaustion. I wasn't angry, not in the way they would undoubtedly spin it later. I could already hear their future narratives. Lena's being cold. Lena's always been so intense, so unforgiving. She's cutting us off out of spite. No, it wasn't anger that fueled those clicks on my banking app, nor was it spite that guided my pen across the notebook. It was a profound sense of clarity, a quiet, resolute weariness of being the eternally reliable, endlessly resourceful, and consistently overlooked one. And the thing about being invisible for so long, the thing about being the silent support system, is that people often only notice you when you're suddenly, inexplicably gone. They notice when things start to fall apart, when the safety net they never even realized was there is abruptly removed. The missed mortgage payment wouldn't sting immediately. It wouldn't become a crisis until the final notice arrived in the mail. The canceled home maintenance fund I'd quietly topped up wouldn't matter until the ancient pipes burst again in the frozen depths of January, as they inevitably did every few years. Julian's freelance gigs would still rise and fall like unpredictable waves, but this time, there would be no discreet net beneath him, no quiet older sister stitching it all together with love, guilt, and strategically timed bank transfers. I made no grand announcements. There was no dramatic exit, no tearful confrontations, no cryptic, passive-aggressive Facebook posts hinting at family drama. I didn't even call Aunt Ramona, the only one in the extended family who still consistently mailed handwritten birthday cards in elegant, old-fashioned cursive, the only one who sometimes seemed to see a flicker of the real me. I just unplugged. The half-written Christmas email I drafted earlier, full of forced wishes for warmth, love, and a happy holiday season, I simply deleted it, the words vanishing from the screen like a puff of smoke. The little thrift store Christmas tree I'd set up in the corner of my living room, the one I'd painstakingly decorated with a mismatched collection of ornaments accumulated over years of solitary holidays, I unplugged its lights. The cheerful blinking ceased, plunging that corner into a sudden, stark gloom. The presents I'd wrapped so carefully, so thoughtfully, each one a small beacon of hope, I slid them unceremoniously into the back of the hall closet. Their shiny, festive paper suddenly looked garish, ridiculous, almost insulting in the stark, unwavering light of my decision. I didn't cry then, either. There simply wasn't room for sadness, not yet. There was only this cold, hard, undeniable clarity. Love isn't supposed to feel like an unpaid, full-time job with endless, uncompensated overtime. Family shouldn't feel like a subscription service with a hefty, hidden fee, a fee paid in slivers of your soul. I had spent decades trying to earn what should have been freely, unconditionally given. But I saw it now. Silence, their silence and mine, is not love. And usefulness, however indispensable it might make you seem, is not, and never will be, belonging. Across town, in a house filled with bright lights, festive noise, and the aroma of roasting turkey, they laughed and celebrated without me. And for the very first time in my entire life, I let them. I let them build their celebration on the carefully constructed illusion they had spent years curating, the one where I was the problem, the one whose absence was a relief, the one where my silence would inevitably be interpreted as bitterness, my distance as blame. I let them be, in their world where I was the heavy one, the complicated one, the one who never quite fit the sparkle and shine of their curated holidays. For the first time, I didn't show up. And in doing so, in that quiet act of non-participation, I reclaimed something vital, something I hadn't even fully realized I'd surrendered, myself. Christmas morning arrived soft and gray, the Denver skyline cloaked in a thick, moody fog. Snow clung to the rooftops and tree branches like forgotten frosting, a picturesque scene that usually filled me with a quiet sense of holiday melancholy. The silence outside my apartment window echoed the profound silence within. I sat by the window, wrapped in my favorite old quilt, the one that smelled faintly of rosemary and a comfort that was all my own. A warm mug of cinnamon apple tea, a blend I'd discovered on a rare afternoon off, was cradled in my hands, the steam rising like a fleeting memory. I didn't light the little tree in the corner. Its unlit state felt more honest, more reflective of my current reality. I didn't press play on the carefully curated holiday playlist I once used to fill the empty spaces, the cheerful carols now sounding hollow and out of tune with my inner world. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text. I simply was, quiet, whole, still. It was a novel sensation. The presents I'd wrapped, the ones now relegated to the back of the closet, sat untouched, their colorful, cheerful paper a little naive in retrospect. They looked foreign now, like artifacts from a different era, belonging to someone who still believed that sheer effort and unwavering thoughtfulness could guarantee belonging, could earn affection. But there was no grief that morning, no sharp ache of rejection, no welling tears. Just a pervasive stillness, a sacred, cleansing stillness, like the first deep breath after a long-held scream, like the clean, crisp air after a violent storm has finally passed. I hadn't realized how much internal noise I'd been carrying, the constant hum of anxiety about their needs, their moods, their next potential crisis, until it vanished. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of potential, full of peace. Time moved differently that day, unmoored from the usual frantic pace of holiday obligations. Noon passed like a whisper. There were no frantic calls from my mother about a missing ingredient for the stuffing, no background clatter from their chaotic kitchen filtering through the phone. No festive, slightly forced selfies from Julian and Marina, complete with curated hashtags about joy, blessedness, and perfect emotional alignment. Crucially, there were no Venmo requests for surprise last-minute holiday expenses, no thinly veiled appeals for financial assistance disguised as casual conversation. Just silence. A blessed, unbroken silence. And I felt no urge, no compulsion whatsoever, to interrupt it. It was only when evening began to fall, and the sky outside my window turned a bruised, dramatic purple, that my phone finally buzzed, once. Then again. 3 times in total, short, sharp bursts that sliced through the tranquility. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was probably some forgotten group thread from work, colleagues sharing holiday wishes I'd forgotten to mute. But then, a message lit up the screen. It was from Aunt Ramona. Her text was uncharacteristically blunt. "Lena, can you answer? You've done enough damage already." I froze. Damage? What damage? I hadn't even been there. I hadn't said a word to any of them since the calls excluding me. My phone rang again, her name flashing on the screen. With a sense of unease, I picked up, my voice rough from disuse. "What happened?" Her tone was gentle, almost hesitant, like she was approaching something wounded, something fragile. "They're saying you ruined Christmas," she said quietly, her words careful. "But Lena, you weren't even there." The words hit me like shards of ice. I blinked, trying to process the absurdity of it. How do you ruin something you weren't even invited to, something you were explicitly barred from attending? She hesitated, then began explaining, her account coming in fragmented pieces, relayed through her own distress and disbelief. Apparently, sometime after dinner, well into the wine and festive cheer, Marina, glass in hand, had begun admiring the family photos displayed on the mantel. A common enough holiday activity, a way for a new partner to be integrated into the family lore. She had paused in front of one particular photo, a faded, slightly crooked snapshot from a birthday party long, long ago. In it, I must have been about 11 or 12, caught mid-laugh, wearing a too big maroon sweater, one sleeve nearly swallowing my hand, my hair a wild, untamed mess. A picture of unselfconscious childhood joy, a version of me they had long since forgotten, or perhaps chosen to ignore. Marina had tilted her head, squinting at the image, a thoughtful expression on her face. And then she'd said it, clearly enough for the whole living room, suddenly quiet with anticipation, to hear. "That's Dr. Lena Morgan, isn't it?" Aunt Ramona, who was present, had nodded slowly, a sense of foreboding likely settling over her. "Yes, that's our Lena." Marina then added, her voice carrying a note of genuine admiration, "She's the one who sat with my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, through the night when her son couldn't get there. Saved her life, really? My neighbor raves about her compassion." The air in the room, Ramona recounted, shifted instantly. Laughter cut off abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch. Forks hovered mid-air over plates of leftover turkey. Glasses stopped clinking. Julian, Ramona said, went visibly pale. My mother's carefully constructed festive smile froze on her face. Marina, oblivious to the undercurrents or perhaps acutely aware of them, looked from one stunned face to another and asked, her voice tinged with innocent confusion, "Wait. Lena's your sister? The one you talk about?" No one answered right away, but whatever they managed to stammer out, whatever half-truth or evasive comment came next, it was enough. Enough for Marina, a woman who, for all her talk of emotional alignment, apparently possessed a keen sense of integrity. She gathered her things, thanked everyone with a politeness so sharp it could have cut glass, and walked out. Just like that. By the time Aunt Ramona called me, the ripple effect had already begun. Marina, it turned out, had posted something on her widely followed social media. Nothing overtly explosive, Ramona explained, but something pointedly honest. A few sharp, elegantly phrased lines about how some families rewrite their members to fit prettier, more convenient narratives. About how silence can be a powerful form of eraser. About the subtle, insidious damage done in rooms lined with smiling photographs of people you simultaneously depend on and pretend don't truly exist in the way they should. I didn't know the exact wording of her post at that moment, and I didn't need to. I could picture it clearly, the sudden, shocking crash of their carefully curated public image. The family friends, the wider social circle, Julian's artistic contacts, all reading between the lines. The art world, especially in cities like New York where Julian aspired to make his mark, was small and notoriously gossipy. I could envision the quiet, rapid unraveling of a personal brand built on charm, curated authenticity, and an air of effortless exclusivity. And for once, someone else had noticed. Not someone raised within the suffocating confines of our family dynamic, not someone trained from birth to interpret casual cruelty as affection or neglect as independence. Someone from the outside, someone who had seen me, even briefly, not as a burden or a problem, but as a human being. A doctor. A sister whose existence was apparently an inconvenient truth. That night, sitting alone in the profound stillness of my small apartment, I learned something far more powerful than any cutting remark or well-argued comeback I could have ever delivered. Sometimes, the sharpest, most undeniable truth is simply the silence you leave behind, the void created by your absence, a void that others, unexpectedly, might just choose to fill with their own observations. The day after Christmas, the desperation began, leaking through the polished cracks of their composure like water seeping through a faulty dam. An email landed in my inbox, its subject line a blandly corporate, "Let's reset things." It read like a poorly drafted internal memo, full of empty platitudes and devoid of any genuine emotion or accountability. It was all very polished, very professional, and utterly hollow. Phrases like heightened emotions, holiday stress, and valuing family above all were scattered throughout, attempting to normalize their behavior and diminish my reaction. It was signed jointly by my mother, my father, and Julian, as if their sudden united front could magically overwrite decades of systemic fracture and selective memory. There was no real apology, no acknowledgement of the pain they'd inflicted, just vague talk of misunderstandings and a desire to move forward. Buried about halfway down, nestled amongst the meaningless fluff, I found the real request, the true purpose of their outreach. Could I, please, reach out to Marina? Clarify things. Smooth it over. You know, for Julian. Not because they missed me. Not because they had experienced some profound epiphany about their treatment of me. Not because they finally understood the depth of the hurt they had caused. No, it was because Julian's burgeoning, and perpetually fragile, art career was now potentially at risk due to Marina's pointed social media post and her abrupt departure from their Christmas festivities. The potential damage to his image, his brand, was the catalyst. It wasn't about me. It had never truly been about me. It was always about the mess, and how my absence, or in this case, the reason for my absence as exposed by an outsider, had inconvenienced them and threatened their carefully constructed world. They hadn't reached out because they yearned for my presence at their table, they had simply, and rather quickly, realized that the cost of erasing me, or at least, the cost of being seen to erase me, had suddenly risen higher than they were willing to pay. I didn't reply to the email. I read it once, a cold knot of something unnameable tightening in my stomach, and then I archived it, a digital tombstone for their disingenuous attempt at reconciliation. That night, as a fresh layer of snow whispered softly against my windows, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't family. It was David Reynolds, the hospital administrator, a man I'd only met formally once or twice at a charity gala or a department head's meeting. Kind eyes, I remembered, and a firm, no-nonsense handshake. He sounded hesitant, uncomfortable. "Lena," he began, his voice carefully neutral, "this is a little awkward, but I received a rather unusual call this evening. It was from your father." He cleared his throat, a small, nervous sound. He said he's worried about your emotional well-being. That maybe you've been under a lot of stress lately, from work and, well, other things. He suggested you might need some time off, perhaps a leave of absence to get yourself together." My blood turned to ice. Not the kind of ice that numbs, but the kind that hardens, that sharpens into a weapon. Weaponizing concern. My father, the man who had once laughed off my ambitions by saying I was too intense for my own good, the man who dismissed my dedication as obsessive, was now attempting to use that very perceived trait to paint me as unstable, as mentally fragile. Not because he genuinely believed it, I knew that with chilling certainty. But because he thought it would control me, shake me, scare me back into silence and compliance. It didn't work. David, to his credit, saw through it. He said as much, in carefully chosen, diplomatic words. He'd assured my father that my performance at the hospital was exemplary, that I was a valued and highly competent member of the medical staff. He'd even gently suggested that perhaps family matters should remain private. But the message from my family was crystal clear: they weren't seeking reconciliation, they were seeking leverage. And when that blatant attempt at manipulation failed, the next move came swiftly. It was a more insidious, curated smear campaign, conducted through whispered group texts to unsuspecting cousins and distant aunts, people I hadn't spoken to in years. "Lena's just going through a really tough time right now. She's isolating herself. She's clearly overwhelmed, bless her heart." No mention of the Christmas exclusion, of course. No mention of the reasons behind my isolation. Just concern, that same performative, weaponized concern, twisted into a tool of control and narrative management. A cousin I hadn't seen since Julian's first disastrous art show 10 years prior messaged me out of the blue. "Hey love, thinking of you. If you ever need a yoga retreat or a wellness weekend, I've got a great discount code. Just breathe." Overwhelmed. The sheer audacity of it was almost breathtaking. Each polished manipulation, every betrayal wrapped in a flimsy disguise of performative care, only sharpened my clarity, solidified my resolve. They weren't protecting me. They were desperately trying to protect their narrative, the one where Julian was the gifted, sensitive heart of the family, and I was the quiet, reliable utility, the one who never made waves, who never asked for anything, who simply existed to serve their needs. But I was done smoothing their story, done being the silent editor of their carefully crafted family myth. The snow outside kept falling, slowly, steadily erasing the footprints of every painful path I'd taken to make myself smaller, more palatable for them. And for the first time, I felt no urge to correct the record, no burning need to defend myself, no compulsion to shout my truth from the rooftops. They could have their narrative. I was busy building my own. But it didn't end there. It never does, not with people who genuinely believe they are entitled to your silence, to your compliance, to your eventual return to the role they've assigned you. The next attempt came wrapped in a different kind of softness, a more direct, perhaps more desperate, appeal. It was my mother's voice, her actual presence, outside my apartment door on a quiet, bitterly cold Sunday in mid-January. The kind of bone-deep winter cold that presses against the windows like a physical entity, like it's breathing. I was at my small desk, charting patient notes from my weekend rounds, a half-empty mug of tea, now lukewarm, set forgotten beside my laptop. That's when I heard it, a soft, hesitant knock on the door. I didn't move immediately. I just listened, my heartbeat surprisingly steady, calm. Then, I rose, walked to the door, and looked through the peephole. There they were, my mother, my father, and Julian, all three of them, bundled in heavy coats against the biting wind, their smiles stretched thin and unconvincing across their faces. A picture-perfect tableau of a concerned family, framed in the cold, hard light of desperation. I wouldn't open the door, not yet. I didn't feel fear, not anymore. Just a detached, aching sadness, the kind you feel when you finally, irrevocably realize that the rescue ship you spent years, decades even. Watching for on the distant horizon was just another mirage, a trick of the light, a figment of your own hopeful imagination. I opened the door just an inch, a tiny crack, just enough to let the frigid outside air slip through and sting my skin, a sharp reminder of the world they inhabited. It wasn't enough to invite them in, not nearly enough for them to push their way through. My mother spoke first, her voice soft, practiced, coated in that familiar veneer of something that was meant to sound maternal, caring. "Lena, sweetheart, we just want to talk," she said, her gloved hands gripping her purse tightly, as if it might contain all the right words, the magic phrases that would reset everything to her liking. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't soften my stance or my expression. Because I finally saw them, with a clarity that was as painful as it was liberating. They weren't here for me. Not for the Lena who was slowly, painfully emerging from the wreckage of their expectations. They were here for the old version of me, the one who still believed, against all evidence, that love could be earned through endless sacrifice, the girl who would fold herself smaller and smaller and smaller just to squeeze into the tiny, airless spaces they grudgingly offered. That girl, I realized with a profound sense of finality, didn't live here anymore. Silence swelled between us, brittle and loud in the narrow hallway. I watched my father's jaw twitch, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of irritation in his eyes. Julian shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, his trendy sneakers looking out of place against the worn welcome mat, as if he wished they might magically lift him off my porch entirely and transport him back to a reality where his actions had no inconvenient consequences. They were uncomfortable. Good. After a moment, a long stretched moment where the only sound was the distant moan of the wind, I gave them the only word that mattered, the only word that was true. No. Just that. No grand speeches, no itemized list of grievances, no justifications or explanations. No bridges painstakingly built out of my own splintered bones for them to cross back into my life. Just a simple, unequivocal no. My mother's face cracked, a visible fissure in her carefully composed expression. Part confusion, part disbelief, as if she genuinely couldn't fathom that the reliable, silent scaffolding she'd leaned on so heavily for decades had finally, deliberately, crumbled by its own choice, not by accident or neglect. I closed the door, quietly. Not a slam, not a dramatic statement. Just a boundary, firm and unyielding. I locked it, the click of the deadbolt sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. With steady hands. Outside, I heard the rise and fall of muffled voices. First pleading, then sharper, tinged with the raw frustration of people who are not accustomed to being denied, people for whom the word no from me was an entirely foreign concept. But I didn't listen. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and wrapped my fingers around my now cold mug of tea, letting the silence of my apartment wrap around me like something sacred, something earned. On the small shelf beside my desk, facing me, sat the framed letter I had recently received from Marina. The ink was slightly smudged in places, her handwriting pressed with intention and a fierce, unexpected care. I looked at it, at her words of gratitude and recognition, and felt, for the very first time in what felt like an eternity, weightless. I thought of all the years I'd spent trying to mold myself into a daughter they could applaud, a sister they could admire, or at least tolerate without complaint. I thought of how I'd soaked up their guilt, their silent reproaches, their casual neglect, and somehow twisted it into fuel to keep showing up, to keep trying, to keep hoping. I was never meant to be a mirror, I realized, born only to reflect their pride or to absorb their disappointment. I was something else, something whole and complete on my own. And maybe, just maybe, finally, that was enough. They didn't leave right away. I heard shoes shuffle on the porch, voices murmur, desperation curling at the edges of their words, words I deliberately tuned out. Then, another knock, softer this time, almost pleading. "Lena, please." It was Julian's voice. "We just want to talk." I stayed seated, the framed letter from Marina anchoring me, my tea cold, slightly bitter, and strangely, deeply satisfying. I let the knocking continue, a desperate, fading rhythm, until it softened, then stopped altogether. Silence settled again, not hollow this time, but full, resonant. For the first time, I truly understood. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reopening the door. Sometimes, forgiveness means choosing not to. Sometimes, it means standing tall, quietly, resolutely, while the very people who fractured you exhaust themselves against the boundary you finally, painstakingly, had the strength to build. A wall not made of bitterness or spite, but of hard-won self-worth. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then came the unmistakable shuffle of retreating footsteps on the wooden porch, the dull, distant clunk of car doors closing, the hesitant, reluctant hum of an engine turning over, catching, then slowly fading into the general murmur of the snow-dusted street. They were gone. Not placated, not forgiven in the way they sought, but simply, finally, denied. I stood then, and walked slowly to the window, drawing the curtain back just enough to see the red taillights of their car disappearing into the gray, snowy afternoon. I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for my phone. I felt no anachronistic pull to run after them, no aching, familiar desire to fix what they, with their silence and their demands, had so thoroughly broken. Only peace. Real peace. The kind that settles deep in your chest, warm and solid, when you finally stop begging for a seat at a table that was never, ever truly set for you. I turned away from the window. My small apartment felt warmer now, somehow. Not louder, not brighter, just mine. The little Christmas tree still stood in the corner, its lights unplugged, its mismatched ornaments untouched, but it no longer looked sad or neglected. The wrapped gifts, still hidden in the closet, were no longer symbols of rejection or wasted effort. They were reminders. Reminders that I had tried. I had loved. I had given the best parts of myself with open, hopeful hands. They just never saw it. Or, perhaps, they chose not to. And that, I was finally beginning to understand, was their loss, not mine. I made myself another cup of tea, stronger this time, Earl Grey with a splash of milk, letting the fragrant steam rise around my face as I pulled the old quilt tighter across my shoulders and returned to my desk, to my patient notes, to my life. The letter from Marina caught the pale afternoon light filtering through the window. "You made a difference," she had written, her words a quiet balm to old wounds. "You didn't give up on her. You made her feel like she mattered." My fingers brushed the simple wooden frame, imperfect, solid. The cool glass was smooth beneath my skin, real, unshakable. A quiet testament. Even when your own family refuses to see your worth, someone else will. Someone honest. Someone watching from the periphery. Someone who recognizes strength not as a utility to be exploited, but as a quality to be admired. I thought of all the years I had spent folding myself smaller and smaller to fit their narrow expectations, and I finally, truly, realized I was never meant to be smaller. Not for them. Not for Julian's comfort, or my mother's anxieties, or my father's unacknowledged disappointments. Not for anyone. Closing the door hadn't been an act of cruelty, though I knew they would frame it that way. It had been an act of profound clarity. They hadn't come because they loved me, not in the way that truly mattered. They had come because they needed something. They needed control. They needed the quiet, dependable, endlessly accommodating version of me, the one who no longer existed. But that girl, she was gone. In her place stood a woman who finally, irrevocably, knew that love doesn't require your silence. It doesn't demand your endless sacrifice. And it never, ever asks you to shatter yourself just to keep someone else whole. I sat back, sipped my tea, and watched the snow continue to fall soft, silent, cleansing. And I realized, with a jolt that was both startling and exhilarating, that this time, I had saved myself. Maybe for the very first time, I was truly, undeniably, free. The days that followed passed slowly, gently, like a series of deep, restorative breaths after a long and arduous storm. The silence in my apartment no longer felt like isolation, it felt like space. Space to think, space to heal, space I had never truly been allowed to claim before. I went back to work, to the familiar rhythms of the hospital. I made my rounds, checked on my patients, sat with those whose families came laden with flowers and cards and whispered words of comfort, and with those whose rooms stayed stubbornly empty, except for the quiet, rhythmic hum of medical machines and my own steady, unobtrusive presence. I listened. I stayed. I did the work that mattered, the quiet, often unseen work that doesn't trend online, that doesn't make for glossy photo albums or celebratory social media posts, but that holds lives and dignity together all the same. Then, one afternoon, about a week later, a small, unassuming package arrived. No return address, just my name handwritten on the plain brown paper in neat, slightly slanted lettering. I opened it carefully, a flicker of apprehension mixed with curiosity. Inside, nestled on a bed of tissue paper, was a small, beautifully bound journal and a single sheet of thick, ivory stationery, the ink slightly smudged at the edges, as if written with great care and emotion. It was from Marina. She wrote about her grandmother, the neighbor I had cared for. She wrote about how her grandmother still practiced her gentle yoga routines twice a week, how she still walked to the local farmer's market every Saturday, a small wicker basket on her arm, a determined sparkle in her eye. She remembered, Marina wrote, in vivid, painful detail, the days when the world, including some of her own family, had quietly, subtly, started giving up on her, treating her as if her life was essentially over. And how there had been one doctor, one quiet, persistent presence, who had stayed past designated visiting hours, who had listened to her stories, who had treated her not just as a patient defined by her ailments, but as a person, a woman still capable of joy, still worthy of dignity and respect. You didn't just save her life, Marina wrote, her words echoing something I had once read in a patient's thank you card years ago. You reminded her she was still living it. I read the letter 3 times, my fingers tracing the words as if to absorb their meaning through my skin. And that night, I framed it. I hung it on the wall above my desk, in a simple, unadorned frame, a spot where the early morning sun could touch it each day. A quiet, permanent reminder. I was never invisible. I was never too much. I was never a burden. I was exactly who I needed to be, all along. And their inability, or unwillingness, to see that, to acknowledge that, to cherish that was never mine to carry. Weeks later, predictably, another email arrived from my family. Less polished this time, more overtly desperate, the corporate jargon replaced by a thin veneer of strained affection. We miss you, Lena. We never meant to hurt you. Can we please just start over? And then, buried near the end, like a tiny, sharp sliver of glass under the skin, came the real reason, the true agenda. Please, can you ask Marina to take down her post? Julian is having trouble finding gallery representation now. It's really affecting his future. Not an apology, not true remorse, not an ounce of understanding for the pain I had endured. Just another transaction. Another emotional debt they implicitly assumed I would pay. Another piece of myself they expected me to sacrifice to keep their peace, to protect Julian's precious future. I didn't respond. Some bridges, I now understood, don't need rebuilding. Some doors, once firmly and intentionally closed, are meant to stay that way. Not out of hate, or bitterness, or a desire for revenge, but out of a profound, unshakable self-respect. That evening, as I sat filing patient notes at my desk, the late afternoon sunlight stretched across my small living room, illuminating the framed letter from Marina. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, I felt truly, unequivocally whole. Not because someone else had finally told me I mattered, but because I had finally, definitively, stopped asking for their permission to believe it myself. If my story, this journey from quiet invisibility to a hard-won, peaceful autonomy, has resonated with you in any way, I'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below. Tell me what part hit home for you, or simply say, I see you. Because maybe, just maybe, in sharing our stories, in acknowledging each other's struggles and triumphs, we remind others, and ourselves, that they're not alone. If you've ever felt overlooked, undervalued, like you had to earn love through silence, through endless sacrifice, through constant self-effacement, please know this. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to say no. And you are absolutely unequivocally allowed to build a life that doesn't include people who only show up when it benefits them, who only value you for what you can provide. Let's start choosing peace over performance, Authenticity over applause. Let's start choosing ourselves.